have a quick question for you. How would you finish this sentence? When I was a kid, I always. I'm asking because I was recently reminiscing about my childhood with some of my friends. All of their kids are finishing up school exams and making summer plans. So while we were talking about that, we were also talking about our childhood experiences. Like when I was a kid, I always went to summer camp. Or when I was a kid, I remember that we always went to Minnesota to visit my grandparents, and my grandmother would play cards with me every afternoon. That conversation with my friends was all about talking about the past and telling stories. And in the process, we used three different structures to help us do that. Each one of those structures does a slightly different job. So, this lesson is going to walk you through all three of them so that you can tell your own stories. The first grammar structure to know is combining used to plus the base form of a verb. I want you to think about used to as a way of contrasting the past with the present. When English speakers use it, they're really saying that things were different back then. We say used to when we want to highlight a change in our life, in our habits, in our personality, or something that we used to do or own, but not any longer. When we use this structure, the listener immediately understands that whatever you're describing about the past is no longer true. So let's look at some examples to illustrate this. First, I used to live in Washington, D.C. I used to be shy in my second language, and I used to have a red sob, and I loved it. In those examples, we have used to live, used to be, and used to have. So we're following that exact structure. To build on this, I want you to imagine that you're telling a friend about how much your life has changed since becoming a parent. In that conversation, you might say, before I had kids, I used to travel a lot. In fact, I used to take 3 or 4 international trips a year. I kind of miss all that travel. Notice how, in those examples, the words used to signal change. The travel is not happening anymore. That's the work that this grammar structure does. So now that you have that pattern, here are some of the most common moments to use it. The first is when you're talking about lifestyle changes. For example, I used to live in Washington, D.C. That sentence makes clear that it's no longer true. I no longer live there. The second is a past identity or state, as in, I used to be shy in my second language. Again, that identity or state is no longer true. The next moment when this is a great structure to use is when you want to indicate that you had something in the past, but you no longer have it now. As in that example, I used to have a red sob. And then finally, this is great for talking about old habits or hobbies. For example, I used to have a paper calendar for everything, but now I've switched to a digital calendar. Okay, that's not really true. I love my paper calendars, but it's a great example. And I know that having more examples for lifestyle changes, old habits, and past identities is super helpful. That's why I've provided many more examples using different versions of this exact structure in my full lesson over at my Speak Confident English website. So I recommend that you definitely check that out, and I'll leave a link for you in the notes below. All right, the second grammar structure for talking about the past is to use the word would with the base form of the verb. I love this structure because it brings past routines to life. It tells your listener what happened over and over again during a specific period of time in your past. In fact, it helps a memory feel like it's in motion. It helps someone visualize it. Maybe it's a childhood routine that you had, or the way you're describing someone's quirks or character traits, or perhaps a repeated moment that meant something important to you. This particular structure works beautifully in storytelling because it really invites your listener in to imagine the scene with you. Now, before I give you some examples, I want to talk about one important note. Unlike the structure with used to, we cannot use would unless we've already established the time frame. For example, if I just start talking to you and I randomly say, I would walk to school, now I drive, you have no idea what I'm talking about or when I'm talking about. However, there's so much more clarity when you say, when I was a kid, I would walk to school. So when you use this structure, it's important to always set that time frame first. For example, when I was a kid, we would play hide and seek every night outside in the summer. Or I remember my grandmother would always play cards with me. Back then, I would get up early and run first thing. Once again, I want to look at how this works in a real conversation. So picture your aunt or uncle sitting across from you at the dinner table, and they're describing your great grandparents' home from their childhood memories. To help paint the picture, they might say, when I was little, our family used to spend every Sunday at our grandparents' house. Grandpa would sit in his big green chair reading the paper while Grandma would be in the kitchen all morning, and the whole house would smell like garlic and tomatoes by lunchtime. Do you notice how using would in a few of those sentences really makes the routine of that memory come alive? You can almost see someone's grandfather sitting in his chair, and you can almost imagine the smell of the kitchen. I want to give you some specific situations when this structure works well, but before I do, there's one more important note about this particular word. Would describes repeated actions, not a continuous state. Let me explain what that means. If you're describing something that is true across a whole period of time without any breaks, like being shy or being afraid of dogs or loving a particular location, those are moments when we use used to. For example, I used to be afraid of dogs, not I would be afraid of dogs. This is one of the most common mistakes I hear with the word would, which is why I want to share it with you right now. Now, one more thing about this structure is that it's very often associated with nostalgic storytelling. And nostalgic storytelling is one of the most natural ways that English speakers build closeness with each other in conversation. But it isn't just this grammar structure that creates that nostalgic feeling. There's something else that's doing the real work of creating that feeling. And I'll show you exactly what it is at the end of this lesson after we've looked at all three structures together. So let's continue and talk about when to use would. Once you have the pattern in place, it's wonderful to use for childhood memories or old traditions. For example, when I was a kid, we would play hide and seek every night in the summer. Or every summer, we would travel to Minnesota. This structure also works really well when you want to describe a person, not how they look or how they were, but through their repeated actions. For example, when we were in college, my roommate would start singing the moment she woke up. And it's great for your own past routines, as in, back then, I would get up early and run first thing. Now, once again, if you want to see more example sentences with different ways to use would to describe childhood memories or past routines, be sure to check out this lesson over at my Speak Confident English website. And now let's get to the third structure for sharing past memories or telling stories about the past. In this structure, we use the past simple with adverbs of frequency, such as always, never, sometimes, usually, every week, every summer, and so on. Sometimes when telling stories about the past, you don't want to paint a picture, you just want to share the facts, like how often something happened, or how long it lasted, or what was simply true at that time. And this is a perfect situation to use the past simple with those frequency adverbs or other time expressions. Here, the focus isn't on emotion, it's on the facts. As a result, it's the most straightforward and common way to talk about the past. For example, when I was a kid, we always had toast for breakfast. Or growing up, we never watched TV until our homework was finished. Or every summer, we went to Colorado. Now, with these three structures, if you ever feel stuck or you're not sure which structure to use to talk about the past simple is always the safest choice. So let's see this in a real conversation. Imagine you're getting to know a coworker and you start talking about your university experience. In describing their first year, they might say, during my first year at university, I rarely went out. Instead, I studied at the library until it closed at midnight, and I never missed a lecture. Looking back, I think I worked too hard, but I got the grades I needed. Do you notice how this was really about what was true at the time, not a lot of nostalgia or trying to describe a scene? Instead, it's really focused on the facts of that time. Now, here's what this structure works really well for. First, when you're stating the frequency of a past habit, as in how often it happened. For example, when I was a kid, I always. When I was a kid, I always had toast for breakfast. We also use it to talk about habits that relate to a specific time period in the past. For example, during my childhood, we often went to Colorado for summer vacation. And we use it to highlight neutral facts about the past, as in, my childhood best friend always called me Annie Banani. I never liked it, and she was the only person who was allowed to call me that. Now, just like I did with used to and would, I've got many more examples of how to use this structure in my full lesson over at my Speak Confident English website. And again, I'll leave a link in the notes below. Okay, now you've seen each individual structure on its own. But in real everyday conversations, English speakers don't just use one, we use all three. And I want to show you what that sounds like in natural storytelling. So, in this one, I want you to imagine that you're talking to your mother and she starts telling you about her very first job. In that storytelling, she might use all three structures together like this. I used to work at a small bookstore downtown. It was my first real job out of college. Every Saturday morning, my manager would bring fresh croissants for the whole team, and we would gather together in the back room before opening. I always arrived at 8:30 a.m., even though my shift started at 9. Honestly, I used to think I would work there forever. It was really my dream job. But then at some point, the lease ended, the owner retired, and the building became a phone store. Okay, not only did that story use all three structures that we've just talked about, but you may have noticed it also felt a little nostalgic, a little bit happy and a little bit sad at the same time. So, how do you create that feeling when telling your own stories? We highlighted the word would earlier, but that word alone doesn't create that nostalgic feeling. If I used that same structure in a totally different context, it doesn't mean that I have that nostalgia. For example, every Sunday, my dad would check his email and pay the bills before lunch. That's not a very nostalgic story, but we're still using the same form of would plus the base form of a verb. So, what exactly made that bookstore story feel different? There were four things that were happening. First, the sensory details. These are the things that you see, hear, smell, taste, and touch, like the fresh croissants, the back room with your coworkers, the 8:30 a.m. arrival in the empty store. Nostalgia comes from these specific physical details, not general statements. The second thing was named people and places, as in the manager, the bookstore downtown, the phone store at the end. The more specific you get, the more real that memory feels. The third key element was the signal of time and distance. As in the sentence, it was my first real job out of college. This kind of frame or sentence prepares your listener to feel that gap between then and now. Without it, you're just describing a routine from the past, not remembering one fondly. And then the fourth key element is a moment in the story that highlights what is gone. And this one matters the most. We had that sentence, but then at some point the lease ended, the owner retired, and the building became a phone store. That ending is where the story tips into nostalgia. It tells the listener, this isn't here anymore, although I wish it was. So, if when you're talking about your past, you want your stories to have that nostalgic feel, would is a good start, but you have to fill the sentences with all those details. So, now to quickly recap, here's what I want you to keep in mind when you want to tell stories about your past. One, used to signals a change. Something is no longer true. Would brings a repeated routine to life inside a specific time in the past. And the past simple with frequency adverbs state the facts. So now let's go back to the sentence from the beginning of this lesson. When I was a kid, I always. I want you to try again. And this time, try telling a 30-second story using all three structures that we've learned. Pick a memory, a childhood routine, an old job that you loved, a place where you used to live, or a person you used to spend a lot of time with. Try telling that story. And if you want to, you can share your story with me in the comments below. As always, if you found this lesson helpful, don't forget to subscribe or follow wherever you're watching or listening from today. Thank you so much for joining me, and I look forward to next time.